I stepped out of the hospital into cold fluorescent light spilling across the pavement and knew I was already late. The meeting upstairs had ended the way these meetings always ended, with lawyers clearing their throats and administrators choosing safety over children. The pediatric support program was suspended effective immediately pending further review because risk had finally outweighed responsibility. My assistant walked beside me speaking quickly about schedules and optics, and the car waiting out front. Security lingered near the doors because someone had tipped off a local reporter. I nodded without listening because all I wanted was distance. That was when I saw them. A woman and a small girl sat on the metal bench just outside the emergency entrance, beneath a sign that read, "No loitering." They had clearly been told to move along and had nowhere else to go. The girl was coughing deep, rough coughs that shook her thin shoulders. The mother wrapped her arms around the child and tried to hide the sound inside her coat. She did not look up when I slowed my steps. She did not ask for help. She looked like someone who had already been told no too many times. My assistant said my name softly as a warning. If I stopped now, there would be photos and questions and explanations. If I sat down, it could be framed as a stunt or a confession or something worse. I knew the protocol. I also knew that if I walked past them, I would remember this bench long after the headlines faded. The safest choice was to keep moving. I stopped. I turned back and sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving space between us. I did not introduce myself. I did not speak. I just sat there feeling every eye land on me. The air felt tighter, as if the decision itself had weight. A nurse glanced over, then looked away. Security shifted their stance but did not intervene. The mother finally looked at me, and her eyes were guarded and tired. I nodded once to acknowledge her without asking for anything. The girl stopped coughing long enough to study my face. She did not seem afraid. She seemed curious, as if adults sitting quietly was unusual but acceptable. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by her breathing. I felt my phone vibrate and ignored it. For once, I was not performing or deciding or fixing. I was just present in a place I was not supposed to be. The girl tilted her head and spoke. "Are you leaving too?" she asked. The question landed heavier than any accusation. I opened my mouth and realized I did not know the answer. Around us, the hospital kept moving as if nothing important was happening. But on that bench, everything felt suspended. I knew whatever I did next would define more than this moment. I stayed seated and met her eyes. "I am still here," I said quietly. The mother exhaled a breath she had been holding and did not pull her daughter away. I had no idea then how much that answer would cost me. I only knew that standing up would be easier than staying. So I stayed. The cold from the bench seeped through my coat and into my back. It felt appropriate. A price for choosing the wrong place at the wrong time. Somewhere behind me, my assistant stopped talking. I imagined the headlines that might come if someone took a picture. I also imagined the silence that would follow if I walked away. The bench was narrow and unforgiving. The space between us remained respectful and deliberate. No one touched. No one asked. Everything important was happening without words. I wondered how many times in my life I had chosen motion over meaning. This time, stillness felt heavier but honest. The girl leaned closer to her mother and rested her head against her arm. The mother adjusted the coat again and finally looked away from me. I sensed a fragile permission in that movement. The hospital doors slid open and closed behind us with mechanical indifference. Life went on. I stayed seated because leaving would have been easier and I was tired of easy. The girl lifted her head again and watched me closely. I held her gaze without smiling or reassuring her. Whatever came next had to be real. That was the moment I understood I could no longer pretend this was a pause. It was a beginning, whether I wanted it or not. The bench creaked softly as I shifted my weight and committed to staying. The girl took a breath and prepared to speak again. I waited, knowing the next words would change everything. I did not stand up. I listened. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt crowded, as if every person passing through the automatic doors carried an opinion that pressed against my back. I could sense security watching from the corner of my eye, waiting for a cue to intervene, and my assistant frozen a few steps away, unsure whether to pull me up or pretend not to know me. The mother sat rigid, her body angled protectively around the girl as though my presence were another unpredictable element she had to manage. I did not blame her. Men in suits rarely stopped without wanting something. I rested my hands on my knees and kept my posture open, not leaning in, not pulling away, letting the bench decide the distance. The girl resumed coughing softer this time, and her mother counted the breaths under her own as if numbers could keep panic contained. A nurse walked past, slowed, then kept going, her badge swinging gently. Another family exited the emergency room, arguing in low voices, and did not look at us. Time stretched in a way it never did in boardrooms. No one spoke. The quiet itself became a question. I realized how accustomed I was to filling space with explanations and authority, and how exposed I felt without either. The girl stopped coughing and began talking to no one in particular about a cartoon she liked about a bear who waited for his friend all winter. Her voice was thin but steady. She did not seem to expect a response, and that somehow made it easier to listen. The mother flinched when her phone buzzed and then relaxed when it was only a reminder she could not act on yet. I could feel the accusation forming not from them, but from myself. What was I doing here if I could not fix this? What was the point of sitting still when solutions were always demanded of me? The bench was cold enough that it crept through my coat, and I welcomed the discomfort because it anchored me. A security guard cleared his throat a few feet away and met my eyes. I nodded slightly to acknowledge him, and he looked uncertain, then turned back to the doors. The girl glanced at him and then back to me and smiled as if we were sharing a secret. I did not smile back. I wanted to be honest even in my face. The mother finally spoke, her voice low and controlled. "You do not have to stay," she said. I heard pride in it and fear and a practiced refusal. I answered without thinking. "I know," I said, and that was all. She studied me again, measuring the weight of that answer. The silence thickened, then shifted. It no longer felt like waiting, it felt like witnessing. I thought about the countless moments I had walked past discomfort because stopping would complicate things. I thought about the ease with which I justified those decisions as necessary. The girl leaned closer to her mother and whispered something I could not hear, and the mother shook her head gently. I caught the word tired. The girl swung her feet and watched them not touching the ground. I noticed how small her shoes were and how worn. Another nurse passed and offered a cup of water to the mother without stopping long enough to talk. The mother thanked her quietly. She did not offer me anything, and I did not reach for the cup. We existed in parallel. Minutes ticked by. My phone vibrated again and again. Somewhere upstairs, a decision I had been part of was already rippling outward. The silence accused me not with anger, but with clarity. It asked whether my presence here meant anything if I would eventually stand and leave unchanged. I felt the urge to stand, to end the discomfort and reclaim motion. I imagined myself walking back to the car, nodding at my assistant and framing the moment as unfortunate but unavoidable. The image tasted bitter. The girl suddenly looked up at me again. Her eyes were sharp now, curious and unguarded. She asked if I was cold. I answered yes. She nodded as if that made sense and patted the sleeve of her mother's coat, then gestured toward me. The mother hesitated, then extended the edge of the coat an inch, offering nothing more than shared warmth. I shook my head gently. "Thank you," I said, "but I am all right." She withdrew her hand and did not seem offended. The exchange felt important because it established that nothing was owed. The hospital doors slid open and a doctor stepped out, calling a name that was not theirs. The mother stiffened, then relaxed again. The girl sighed and rested her head against her mother's arm. I watched the rise and fall of her breathing, counting with them now without meaning to. The silence had turned into a mirror. It reflected every time I had chosen efficiency over humanity. It also offered a chance to choose differently, without applause. I stayed seated because standing would have been easier, and because I could feel a line forming that once crossed could not be uncrossed. The girl spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom says people leave because they are busy," she said, then paused. "But sometimes they are just scared." The words landed clean and unadorned. I felt something in my chest give way, not dramatically, but enough to hurt. I did not defend myself. I did not correct her. I let the sentence hang between us. The mother closed her eyes briefly and then opened them, looking straight ahead. I realized then that if I stood up now, I would confirm the worst version of myself. The silence waited for my choice, and so did they. I remained seated, knowing this was no longer about being seen by others, but about seeing myself clearly. The bench creaked again as I shifted not to leave, but to settle in. I inhaled slowly and accepted that whatever came next would not be controlled. I was still here, and the silence knew it. The girl lifted her head and studied my face with the kind of attention adults rarely give each other. It was not intrusive or demanding. It was observational, as if she were collecting facts for later. She asked me if I had children. The question was simple, but it caught me off guard because it was not framed as small talk. It felt diagnostic. I answered honestly and said no. She nodded, once absorbing that answer, and then said, "That is lonely," in a matter-of-fact tone, as if she were naming the weather. Her mother stiffened immediately and apologized on her behalf, reaching to touch the girl's shoulder. I shook my head gently and said it was all right, because it was. The girl did not look at her mother for permission to continue. She looked back at me and asked if I worked a lot. I said yes, because there was no benefit in pretending otherwise. She swung her feet again, thinking, "My mom says people leave because they are scared, not because they are busy," she said. The sentence was delivered without accusation, without drama. It landed harder than anything said to me in a courtroom or a board meeting. I felt my throat tighten and did not respond right away. The mother exhaled sharply and said she was sorry again, explaining that her daughter talked too much when she was tired. I said she was fine and meant it. The girl leaned into her mother's side and rested her head there, but kept her eyes on me. I could feel the reflection sharpening. Children did not need context or justification. They saw patterns and named them. I realized how often I hid behind busyness because it sounded responsible. The girl asked where I was going. I said home. She asked if I wanted to go home. I hesitated long enough for the answer to be clear. She nodded again, as if that confirmed something she already suspected. The mother shifted and stood up slowly, pulling the girl closer as if preparing to leave. I sensed that my presence had reached its limit. She said thank you politely, the way people do when they want to close an interaction without conflict. I stood halfway, then stopped, unsure whether to fully rise or remain. The girl tugged gently at her mother's coat and whispered something. The mother hesitated, then sat back down. She looked at me and said she did not mean to be rude, but that they had been asked to move several times already and were waiting for a call that kept being delayed. I said I understood. I asked how long they had been waiting. She told me 3 hours. I did not comment on the injustice of that because she did not need agreement, she needed space. The girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper and began to draw with a stubby pencil. She narrated quietly as she worked, describing a bench and 3 people sitting on it. One was small, one was big, and one was very tired. She labeled them without showing me. I watched her hands steady despite the cough that returned in shallow waves. The mother rubbed her back and murmured reassurances that sounded more like promises to herself. I felt the urge to offer solutions and forced myself not to. This was not a problem to solve. It was a moment to honor. The girl finished her drawing and held it up for me to see. It showed 3 figures sitting side by side with space between them. Above them she had drawn a large circle she said was a light so people could see each other at night. I thanked her and asked who the tired one was. She smiled slightly and said, "All of us." The mother laughed once, then covered her mouth, surprised by the sound. It was the first time she had smiled since I arrived. The girl tucked the drawing back into her bag, satisfied. A doctor stepped out and called a name close enough to make the mother tense again. It was not theirs. The girl sighed and leaned back against the bench. She looked up at me once more and asked, "If you are lonely, why do you stay busy?" The question stripped away any remaining armor. I could not answer with something polished or instructive. I said, "Because it is easier than staying." She considered that, then nodded slowly. The mother closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she looked at me differently, not with trust, but with recognition. She said quietly that they should go soon because the night air was making the cough worse. I stood fully this time, unsure whether that meant the end. The girl looked disappointed for a moment, then composed herself. She said, "Thank you for sitting." Not talking, just sitting. I told her she was welcome and meant it more than she could know. As they stood to leave, the girl turned back and asked one last thing. "Are you going to stay sitting or are you going to be busy again?" The question was not a trap. It was a mirror. I answered honestly and said I did not know yet. She accepted that answer with more grace than most adults ever had. They walked toward the corner of the building and stopped when the mother's phone rang. She answered and listened, then nodded. She turned back to the bench and gestured that they would be staying a bit longer. The girl looked relieved and returned to her spot. I sat back down without being asked. No one clapped. No one noticed. The mirror remained in place, and I could no longer look away from it. When the mother sat back down, it was not an invitation, it was a recalibration. She adjusted the collar of her coat and positioned her body so that the girl was shielded from the wind and from me in equal measure. Her posture was polite but firm, the posture of someone who had learned that kindness without boundaries could become another kind of harm. She thanked me again, and this time added that they did not need anything. The words were clear and deliberate. I told her I understood and that I was not offering anything. That answer surprised her enough that she studied my face again, checking for contradiction. There was none. The girl leaned back against the bench and traced shapes on the cold metal with her finger humming softly between coughs. A security guard approached and glanced between us, uncertain whether protocol had been violated. I met his eyes and said nothing. After a moment, he nodded and stepped back. The mother noticed and stiffened but did not move. She said quietly that she preferred to keep things simple and asked how long I planned to stay. I told her as long as it made sense. She accepted that without comment. We sat in parallel silence, broken only by the sounds of the hospital breathing around us. I noticed how often people passed without seeing us and how often they glanced, then looked away. The girl asked her mother if they were in trouble. The mother said no and squeezed her hand. The girl nodded and resumed humming. I felt the urge to explain myself and resisted it. Explanations were a form of pressure. The mother glanced at my shoes, then at my coat, and finally at my face. She asked if I worked there. I said no. She asked if I was waiting for someone. I said no. She paused and said, "Then you do not have to sit here." I said, "I know." The simplicity of that answer settled something between us. She said she did not want pity. I told her I was not offering it. She said she did not want charity. I told her I was not offering that either. She asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to wait. The word hung between us, unfamiliar and honest. The girl looked up and smiled faintly, as if waiting were a skill she recognized. A nurse stepped out and offered a blanket to the girl. The mother accepted and wrapped it around her carefully. She did not offer me one, and I did not ask. The girl tucked her chin into the blanket and looked at me again. She said my name, even though I had not given it. I realized my assistant must have spoken it earlier when he tried to pull me away. I did not correct her. The mother apologized again, and I told her it was fine. Names were not ownership. They were simply sounds. The girl asked if I was busy. I said not right now. She seemed pleased by that answer. The mother shifted and said they would be moving to the other side of the building if the wait continued. I told her I would not follow unless she asked me to. She nodded, appreciating the clarity. Boundaries created space where trust could breathe. The girl closed her eyes and rested her head against her mother's arm. Her breathing evened out. The mother watched her closely, counting again. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed by degrees as the night deepened. She spoke again this time without apology. She said she had learned to say no early because people often confused help with control. I said that made sense. She said she did not know who I was or what I wanted, and that uncertainty made her cautious. I said that made sense too. The girl stirred and opened her eyes. She asked if we were still waiting. The mother said yes. The girl nodded, satisfied. A car pulled up nearby and idled, then drove off. My phone vibrated and I ignored it. The mother noticed and asked if I needed to take it. I said no. She seemed to weigh that choice, then nodded. She asked why I had stopped in the first place. I answered carefully. I said, because leaving would have been easier. She did not respond immediately. She looked straight ahead and then said that was an honest answer. The girl yawned and curled closer. The mother adjusted the blanket and said they would not be offended if I left now. I said thank you for telling me and stayed seated. She accepted that without further challenge. Time passed in measured breaths. The hospital lights flickered slightly as systems cycled. The bench creaked under our combined weight. The girl spoke softly again and said that sometimes waiting was safer than going home because nothing could change while you waited. The sentence felt older than her years. The mother closed her eyes and pressed her lips together. I felt the resistance ease not into trust, but into tolerance, and that was enough. When I finally stood, it was deliberate and slow. I told her I would be nearby if she needed space and would not return unless invited. She thanked me and meant it. The girl looked up disappointed, then composed herself. She asked if I would come back tomorrow. I said only if they wanted me to. She nodded and said okay. As I turned to leave, she called my name again and said, "Thank you for waiting like a person." I walked a few steps away and stopped. I looked back. The mother met my eyes and gave a small nod that was not permission but acknowledgement. I knew then that if I came back, it would have to be on their terms. I left the bench empty and cold behind me and felt the weight of the boundary settle into place. It was not a wall. It was a line I intended to respect. I returned the next afternoon with a reason that fit neatly inside my calendar and required no explanation to anyone else. I was scheduled to review facilities operations and patient flow as part of an oversight rotation that had been postponed too many times already. It was legitimate work, and that mattered because it meant my presence could not be dismissed as curiosity or guilt. When I walked back toward the emergency entrance, I did not scan the bench right away. I finished my calls and spoke with staff and let the building breathe around me. Only then did I step outside. They were there again in the same place, but not in the same posture. The mother sat straighter and the girl's blanket was folded neatly across her lap. I stopped several feet away and waited. The mother noticed me and did not wave or smile. She simply nodded once. I took that as consent and sat at the far end of the bench, leaving the same space as before. I did not speak first. The girl looked up and said you came back as if confirming a hypothesis. I said I did. She asked if I was busy today. I said less than yesterday. She seemed pleased by that. The mother watched the exchange closely and then said thank you for asking yesterday before returning. I told her it mattered to me. She said it mattered to her too. We sat quietly and listened to the sounds of ambulances arriving and leaving. I noticed how different the bench felt this time, less accusatory, more neutral. Presence without intent softened things. A nurse passed and recognized me from earlier and nodded. The mother noticed and tensed. I said quietly that I was here for work and that my work would not include them unless they asked. She relaxed a fraction. The girl began to talk about school and how waiting made time stretch and how sometimes she pretended the clock was tired too. I listened without correcting or steering. I had learned that staying meant letting the moment be incomplete. The mother asked if I wanted to know why they were waiting outside instead of inside. I said only if she wanted to tell me. She considered that, then said the waiting room was full and loud and the cough made people nervous. She said being asked to step outside felt easier than watching others shift away. I nodded and did not comment on policy. The girl added that the air outside felt cleaner. The mother smiled at that and smoothed her hair. A man in a suit walked past and slowed, then moved on. I felt the familiar urge to manage perceptions and let it pass. The girl asked what I did for work. I told her I helped decide where money went. She frowned and asked if money knew where it was going. I laughed softly and said it often got lost. She nodded as if that made sense. The mother watched me carefully as if waiting for the other shoe. I stayed seated and let time do its work. A doctor stepped out and called another name. The mother flinched, then settled again. She asked how long I would be in and out today. I said a few hours. She asked if that meant I would be coming and going. I said yes. She said she preferred consistency. I told her I would not sit unless invited and would check in before returning. She appreciated the clarity. The girl leaned forward and whispered that she liked when people said what they would do and then did it. I told her I liked that too. We sat until my phone vibrated with a request from inside. I stood slowly and told them I needed to step away for work. The girl asked if I would come back. I said only if they were still there and still wanted company. She nodded and went back to drawing. The mother thanked me for not disappearing without a word. I told her it was the least I could do. I left and did my rounds without rushing. When I returned an hour later, I stopped at a distance and waited. The mother saw me and nodded again. I sat. The girl looked up and said, "You did what you said." The statement was not praise. It was data. Something shifted then because reliability had entered the room. We talked about nothing important and everything important. The girl asked if waiting always ended. I said sometimes it changed shape. She seemed satisfied by that answer. The mother spoke then without defensiveness. She said she had learned not to expect help because it often came with strings. I said I was not tying any. She said she would hold me to that. I told her she should. The girl began to cough again and the mother reached for water. I stayed still. The cough passed. A nurse offered to bring a chair with a back. The mother declined. She said the bench was fine. The nurse looked at me as if asking whether to insist. I shook my head slightly. Respect mattered more than comfort. As the light shifted toward evening, the mother finally said there was a reason they were asked to wait outside that had nothing to do with space. She paused and then said insurance approval was pending and waiting inside made questions harder. The words landed quietly and heavy. I did not respond right away. I nodded once. The girl looked between us, sensing the change. She asked if that was bad. The mother said it was complicated. The girl accepted that and went back to her drawing. I stayed seated and felt the limits of my role clearly for the first time. I could not fix this without breaking the trust we were building. So I did nothing except remain. Presence without power was not weakness. It was discipline. As the evening settled, I stood to leave again and told them I would check back tomorrow. The mother said okay without hesitation. The girl waved with the pencil still in her hand. I walked away knowing that staying had become something active, not passive, and that the real test was still ahead. The evening settled into that uneasy calm hospitals carry when the rush thins but the waiting does not. The lights hummed overhead and the automatic doors sighed open and closed with a rhythm that felt indifferent to hope. I remained seated because leaving now would have looked like retreat, and because something in the air told me this was the hinge of it all. The girl shifted beneath her blanket and watched a gurney roll past with a seriousness that did not belong to someone her age. She asked her mother if the people inside were scared. The mother answered carefully and said sometimes. The girl nodded and turned to me. She asked if I got scared at work. I said yes because pretending otherwise would have been another kind of lie. She seemed relieved by that. She said her mom told her fear was not the problem leaving was. The sentence came out softly as if she were testing it for weight. I felt my chest tighten and tried to slow my breathing. The mother closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them and looked at me as if bracing for a reaction. I said nothing. The girl waited and then asked the question that broke me. If someone can help but chooses not to, is that the same as leaving? The words were not accusatory. They were precise. They cut through every justification I had ever built. I stared at the ground and felt heat rise behind my eyes. I wanted to say it depended. I wanted to say systems are complicated. I wanted to say intentions matter. None of that survived contact with the question. I heard myself answer without rehearsal. Yes, sometimes it is. The mother inhaled sharply. The girl studied my face and nodded as if a piece had fallen into place. She said okay and leaned back against her mother. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of consequences. I felt exposed, not because they knew who I was, but because I knew who I had been. I remembered meetings where we delayed and deferred and told ourselves that waiting was neutral. I remembered signing off on pauses that stretched into losses. I remembered how often I framed inaction as prudence. The bench felt harder under me. A doctor stepped out and called the girl name. The mother stood so fast her blanket slipped. I rose too, but stopped short, letting her take the lead. The girl looked at me once more and asked if I would still be there when she came back. I said yes before thinking. The mother hesitated, then nodded and followed the doctor inside. I remained on the bench alone, feeling the weight of my answer settle into my bones. Time passed differently when you had nowhere to hide. I watched people hurry past with purpose and wondered how many of them believed their urgency excused them from noticing. I sat because standing would have allowed me to perform relief. Sitting required me to stay with the truth I had spoken. My phone buzzed with messages from my assistant asking where I was and whether I wanted to move to a quieter area. I typed back that I was fine and put the phone away. A security guard glanced over and then away. The night air cooled my hands. I thought about the difference between help and rescue. Help respected agency. Rescue erased it. I had been praised my whole career for rescues that made good stories and bad systems. The girl had asked about help, not heroics. The doors opened again and the mother returned with the doctor. The girl looked tired but calmer. The doctor explained next steps and timelines using words chosen to steady rather than alarm. The mother asked practical questions. I listened. When the doctor left, the mother sat back down and exhaled. The girl leaned into her side and closed her eyes. The mother turned to me and said quietly that children noticed what adults avoided. I said I was learning that. She asked why I answered the way I did. I said because the truth was finally louder than my excuses. She did not respond right away. She watched the doors and then said honesty was dangerous but necessary. I agreed. The girl stirred and asked if people ever came back after leaving. I paused and said sometimes they do if they learn how to stay. She smiled faintly and drifted toward sleep. The mother adjusted the blanket and said she would be right back after getting water. She looked at me as if weighing whether to trust the space. I nodded and stayed seated. When she returned, she handed me a paper cup and I accepted it. It was the first thing I had taken. The gesture felt earned, not transactional. We sat without speaking for several minutes. The building breathed. Somewhere, a monitor beeped steadily. I realized then that my answer had committed me to a standard I could not undo. If choosing not to help was a form of leaving, then staying meant more than presence. It meant accountability. I felt fear rise not of them, but of what would be required of me next. I stayed seated anyway because fear was no longer a reason to move. The girl opened her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." I asked for what? She said, for telling the truth. I nodded and held that nod steady. The bench creaked as I shifted closer, not invading space but sharing it. The night deepened, and with it the understanding that the question had not been rhetorical. It was a line drawn. I had crossed it with words. Now I would have to cross it with action or accept that I was still the man who left. Morning arrived without ceremony. The fluorescent lights never dimmed enough to let night feel complete, and by the time the windows lightened, I felt as if I had been awake for years. The girl slept fitfully, and the mother watched every breath as if counting them would keep them steady. A nurse approached with a clipboard and spoke quietly about tests and insurance verification and the way approvals moved slower than illness. I listened and recognized the vocabulary of delay. It sounded professional and harmless, and I knew how much damage it could do. When the nurse left, the mother pressed her lips together and stared at the floor. She said she hated asking questions because answers came with bills. I said nothing. Silence had become my discipline. A doctor returned and explained the condition in plain language. Rare, chronic, manageable with consistent care. The mother asked if outside referrals would be covered. The doctor hesitated. The hesitation said more than his words. I felt the impulse rise to fix it. I held still. The girl woke and asked for juice. The mother went to find some and left me with the doctor. He looked at me more closely now. Recognition flickered. He asked if I worked nearby. I said yes. He nodded and said the system was strained and choices were hard. I agreed. He left. The mother returned and the girl drank slowly. A volunteer rolled in a cart of toys and books. The girl picked a coloring book and pushed the cart back with solemn care. She offered me a crayon and I declined. She shrugged and colored. Time thickened. My phone vibrated again. This time it was the board liaison. There was concern about optics. There were questions about my location. There was a reminder of policy. I typed that I was unavailable and put the phone away again. The mother noticed and asked if I needed to go. I said, not yet. She nodded. The girl asked if I was a doctor. I said no. She asked if I was rich. The mother corrected her gently. I smiled and said money did not make you useful. The girl considered this and went back to coloring. Later, a billing specialist arrived and asked the mother to step aside. They spoke in low voices that were meant to be private and were anything but. I caught fragments about pre-authorization and coverage caps. The mother returned pale and rigid. She asked the specialist if there was any flexibility. The answer was careful and thin. I watched the mother fold inward. I stood. The room felt suddenly too small. I introduced myself to the specialist by first name only and asked to understand the timeline. She recognized me then fully. Her posture changed. She asked to speak privately. The mother looked at me and shook her head. She said no more meetings, no more closed doors. I realized then that my presence had shifted the room in a way that threatened her dignity. I sat back down. The specialist flushed and left. The mother stared at me with something like anger and something like fear. She asked who I was. I told her the truth. I said my name and my role. I said I had come here for work and stayed for a reason I was still learning. The girl looked up and smiled as if the puzzle were solved. The mother did not smile. She stood and gathered their things. She said she could not do this. She said she would not be a story or a test case. She said help that arrived with power always came with strings. I said I would not use money or leverage. She said that was a lie people told themselves. I tried to explain boundaries and presence and restraint. My words sounded practiced even to me. The girl asked her mother if they were leaving. The mother said yes. She turned to me and asked if I could move so she could pass. I moved. They walked toward the doors. The girl looked back once and waved. I raised my hand and did not follow. The bench felt empty in a way that hurt. I told myself this was the right outcome. Consent mattered. Trust could not be forced. Still, the loss settled heavy. Later, I learned the test results would take longer than expected. The day dragged. I attended a meeting across the street and answered questions as if my mind were not elsewhere. When I returned, the bench was empty. A nurse said they had been admitted after a sudden change. My chest tightened. I asked which room and stopped myself. I was not entitled to that information. I sat again. Hours passed. Near evening, the mother appeared in the hallway. She saw me and her expression hardened. She walked past without slowing. I stayed seated. She returned later with a blanket and the girl. The girl waved. The mother did not. She sat several seats away. The distance felt deliberate. I accepted it. A doctor spoke to the mother and left. She finally turned to me. She said she had thought about what I said. She said it scared her because it sounded like hope, and hope had burned her before. She said she did not want to trust me, and that was precisely why she might have to. Then she said she needed space. She asked me to leave. I stood. This time, leaving felt like respect. I said I would be nearby if needed. She did not answer. I walked out into the cool air, believing I had done the right thing and knowing it had shattered something fragile anyway. Trust had broken not because of malice, but because timing had exposed a fault line neither of us could cross alone. I did not return to the bench the next morning. That was the first rule I set for myself after leaving. Staying did not mean hovering. Presence could be quiet without being absent. I went to the office and did the work that had piled up overnight. I answered questions and signed documents and listened to briefings that framed risk as an enemy and delay as prudence. At lunch, I walked past the hospital entrance without stopping. I kept my eyes forward and my hands in my pockets. It felt like restraint, and it hurt like retreat. In the afternoon, I made calls that did not mention names. I asked about seating in emergency waiting areas and how policies were enforced. I asked about heating vents that blew too cold and signs that warned people away from places where they needed to rest. I asked about how long it took for approvals to move from one desk to another and who measured the cost of waiting. No one asked why. They answered because I asked. By evening, the weather shifted and a cold rain settled in. I drove home and did not sleep. The image that stayed with me was the mother's eyes when she realized who I was. The way dignity stiffened her spine. The way trust pulled back to protect itself. I reminded myself that consent mattered more than my comfort. The next day, I learned through a public update that the hospital had adjusted its waiting policy during peak hours. The change was small and temporary and framed as operational. Heated seating was installed near the emergency entrance. A volunteer coordinator was assigned to triage families waiting outside when space overflowed. No announcement named me. I did not ask to be named. That afternoon, I walked past the hospital again, and this time I allowed myself to glance toward the bench. It was empty. I felt relief and disappointment at the same time. Quiet staying meant accepting both. The third day, I received a message from the board liaison asking whether the changes were connected to my visit. I replied that leadership was about removing friction, not adding credit. The message ended there. That evening, I returned after sunset and sat 2 benches away. The rain had stopped and the air smelled clean. A family sat closer to the doors and a volunteer offered blankets. The system moved a little kinder. I did not approach anyone. I sat and watched and counted the ways absence could be active. Near midnight, an ambulance arrived and a rush of motion filled the space. I stood and moved aside with everyone else. When it passed, I sat again. The habit of leaving tugged at me and I resisted it. On the 4th day, I learned through a nurse that the girl had been stabilized and transferred to a unit upstairs. I did not ask for the room number. I left a note with the volunteer coordinator asking that if the mother wanted water or food, it be made easy. I signed only my first name. On the 5th day, the mother appeared in the lobby pushing the girl in a wheelchair. The girl looked smaller than I remembered and brighter too. She saw me and smiled. The mother did not stop. She slowed. That was something. I stood and waited for her to decide. She approached and said quietly that the changes had helped. She said she noticed because she had learned to notice. She said she still did not trust me. I said that made sense. The girl asked if the bench was still mine. I said it never was. She laughed. The mother said they would be discharged soon, but the road ahead was long. She said she would manage. I did not argue. I asked what managing looked like for them. She told me about schedules and buses and paperwork and nights that blurred. I listened and took nothing out of my pocket. When a volunteer approached to offer help, the mother accepted. I stepped back. Later that night, I received an email from facilities confirming the seating would remain through winter. The change was modest and would never trend. That was the point. Over the next weeks, I stayed away and stayed close in ways that did not intrude. I attended meetings where I spoke about friction as harm. I redirected funds toward process, not publicity. I made sure the changes were reviewed by people who would be there long after me. I did not visit the unit. I did not call. Quiet staying required patience. One afternoon, my phone rang and I recognized the number. The mother spoke carefully. She said the girl wanted to show me something and asked if I could meet them in the lobby for 5 minutes. I said yes and arrived early. The girl rolled toward me holding a folded drawing. She opened it to reveal 3 figures on a bench. One was small. One was taller. The third was the bench itself, drawn thicker than the others. She said the bench stayed even when people moved. The mother watched me watch the drawing. She said staying was not about proximity. It was about reliability. I nodded. She asked if I would keep staying even if they did not need me. I said that was the only kind that counted. She did not smile, but her shoulders lowered. A week later, the girl was readmitted in the middle of the night. I learned through a message meant for volunteers that the unit was short-staffed and the waiting room would be crowded. I went to the hospital and sat in the lobby without announcing myself. I stayed through the night and left before morning. I did not see them. I was not there for them to see. The next day, the mother sent a brief message through the volunteer coordinator. She said she noticed the chair was warm when she needed it. She said thank you. I replied that warmth should never be conditional. Quiet staying did not repair everything. It did not erase suspicion or pain. It built a floor where trust could rest without falling through. I learned that staying was a practice, not a promise, and that the hardest part was accepting that it might never be recognized. The bench remained, and so did I, in ways that did not announce themselves. The call came just after midnight, and it did not use my name. It used the language of need and urgency that stripped titles clean. A volunteer coordinator said there had been a sudden admission and the lobby was overflowing again. She did not ask me to come. She said it the way people say the weather has turned. I put on a coat and drove through streets emptied by rain. When I arrived, I did not go to the unit or ask questions. I sat where anyone could sit and let the night do its work. The air smelled of disinfectant and wet wool. A television murmured with closed captions no one read. I watched families count minutes with their feet. Somewhere down the hall, a child cried and the sound cut short. I kept my hands folded and my phone dark. Choosing not to intervene was its own kind of vigilance. Hours passed. A nurse announced delays and apologized without looking at anyone. I saw the mother then. She came through the doors carrying fear like a second coat. The girl was on a gurney with an oxygen mask fogging softly. The mother spotted me and stopped. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood slowly and stayed where I was. She nodded once. That was permission enough to be present, and nothing more. I walked beside them to the waiting area and sat a chair away. The girl lifted her hand weakly, and I lifted mine back. The mother spoke to staff and answered questions with the steady voice of someone who had practiced. When the doors closed behind the gurney, she sagged and then caught herself. I did not reach for her. I said I was here. She sat and breathed. The hours that followed were thin and loud. A vending machine clattered. A janitor polished the floor around our feet. A doctor came out and spoke in careful terms. Stable for now. More tests. Time. The mother nodded and thanked him and then pressed her palms together as if to keep them from shaking. I stayed. I did not arrange anything. I did not make calls. I did not perform competence. I counted breaths with her without saying so. At one point she stood and paced, and I stood with her. At another she sat and I sat too. We mirrored not out of strategy, but out of respect. A social worker approached with forms and questions. The mother answered and then looked at me. I stood and moved away so she could answer without an audience. The social worker glanced at me with recognition and then looked back at her clipboard. The night wore on. At 3, a nurse brought coffee and water. The mother accepted the water and declined the coffee. I accepted neither. Hunger felt inappropriate. When the doctor returned, his face was more relaxed. The girl was responding. The mother exhaled and covered her mouth. She did not cry. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to her knees. I stayed seated because kneeling would have turned it into a scene. When she sat upright again, she looked at me and asked why I was still there. I told her because leaving would have been easier, and easier was not the standard anymore. She studied me and said standards changed when someone paid attention. I said attention was the beginning, not the payment. The waiting room thinned. A security guard dimmed the lights. Dawn crept in around the edges of the glass. A nurse called the mother name and motioned her through. I stood and stayed behind the line. The mother hesitated and then turned back. She said thank you for not trying to help the wrong way. I nodded. The girl passed on the gurney and lifted her fingers again. I lifted mine. When the doors closed, I returned to my chair and waited because waiting was the work now. Later, a doctor came and spoke with me only because the mother asked him to. He explained next steps and timelines. I listened and asked about practical things like transportation and rest. He answered and then asked who I was to them. I said I was someone who sat down. He nodded as if that made sense. When the mother returned, she looked tired and lighter. She said the girl was asleep and asked if I would walk with her to the exit. We walked without speaking. At the doors, she stopped and said the night had clarified something. She said she did not need a savior or a benefactor. She needed a witness who stayed when the outcome was unknown. I said I was learning to be that. She said learning counted. She asked if I would keep sitting even when there was nothing dramatic to see. I said yes. She smiled then, not wide, but real. She went out into the morning and I returned to the lobby and sat again because choice was not a moment, but a practice. The bench had taught me that. I stayed until the city woke and then left without announcement. The night had asked a question and I had answered with my body instead of my mouth. Belonging arrived without ceremony and without permission slips. It did not announce itself or ask for a name. It formed in the ordinary spaces where time was spent together without spectacle. The weeks after that night settled into a rhythm that felt almost quiet enough to trust. Appointments were scheduled and rescheduled. Buses were missed and caught. Paperwork grew and shrank. I learned which chairs in the lobby were kind to the back and which windows let in the least glare. The mother learned which questions unlocked clarity and which only produced rehearsed answers. The girl learned the names of nurses and the shortcuts between units. I learned how to wait without counting minutes. We did not sit together every day. Some days we did not see each other at all. Belonging did not require proximity. It required reliability. When we did meet, it was brief and unremarkable. A nod, a few words, a shared glance when a delay stretched. The girl sometimes brought a book and read aloud to no one in particular. She paused to ask if words could get tired. I said words rest when they are heard. She smiled and kept reading. The mother watched me with a steadiness that had replaced suspicion with assessment. She did not thank me for staying anymore. That was progress. One afternoon, she asked if I would walk with them to the bus stop. The request was plain and practical. I walked. We stood in line with others and waited. When the bus arrived, the driver lowered the ramp and joked about the weather. The girl laughed. The mother adjusted the straps and nodded to the driver. I stepped back and let them board first. Belonging looked like that. Later, the mother asked if I could watch the girl for 10 minutes while she spoke with a coordinator. I said yes and sat on the floor with the girl coloring. She told me about a drawing she wanted to make of a room where people did not rush. I said that sounded like a good room. She asked if rooms could be built from people. I said sometimes. When the mother returned, she thanked the girl, not me. That was correct. Over time, others began to assume I was family, and I did not correct them. Assumptions were light and did not bind us. The mother noticed and asked if that made me uncomfortable. I said labels were tools, and we did not need one for what we were doing. She said she agreed and looked relieved. At a follow-up appointment, a clinician asked for my opinion and then caught herself. The mother answered instead, and I nodded. We kept the pattern clean. I did not sign anything. I did not stand between her and decisions. I stood beside her when decisions were heavy. The girl started physical therapy and complained about exercises. She asked if I would count for her. I counted slowly. She corrected me when I rushed. The therapist smiled. On days when the weather turned bad, I brought an umbrella and held it for them without comment. On days when the weather was fine, I did nothing. Belonging was not about showing up with objects. It was about showing up with attention. One evening, the hospital hosted a small winter gathering in the lobby. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling. A volunteer played soft music. The girl asked if I would stay for one song. I stayed for two. The mother stood nearby and watched the room with an expression that held both gratitude and vigilance. When the song ended, the girl leaned against her and closed her eyes. The mother said she would take her home. She asked if I would walk them to the door. We walked. At the threshold, the mother paused and said she had noticed something. She said I never asked what I was to them. I said that was because the answer would change and I did not want to freeze it. She nodded and said belonging could be earned without being claimed. I agreed. The girl hugged me then without asking. It was brief and fierce. I let my arms respond and then release. The mother did not flinch. Weeks later, the hospital invited me to speak to the board about operational changes. The request made me uneasy. Titles could swallow intent. I asked if the mother would be comfortable with me mentioning the waiting room without names. She considered and said yes if the focus stayed on systems, not stories. I promised it would. When I spoke, I talked about chairs and signage and staffing ratios. I talked about time as a cost paid by the vulnerable. I talked about how sitting down could reveal friction that dashboards missed. I did not mention the bench. Afterward, several members approached with praise. I deflected and left early. That night, I returned to the lobby and sat where anyone could sit. The girl did not come. The mother did not come. Belonging did not require witnesses. It required consistency. Months passed. The girl grew stronger. The mother laughed more easily. I remained present without title. One afternoon, the girl asked what to call me. I said my name was enough. She tried it out loud and nodded as if it fit. The mother smiled. We walked to the door and separated as usual. As they left, the girl turned back and said, "You stay." I said yes. That was the only title I needed. I did not plan the room where the speaking would happen, and that helped. It was a narrow conference space with glass walls that let the hallway remain visible so nothing felt sealed off. I stood at the table without notes and waited for the chairs to fill. People settled with the familiar rustle of authority and expectation. I did not introduce myself beyond my name. I did not mention outcomes. I spoke about what happens when rules become shields instead of tools. I described waiting rooms as systems that teach people what they are worth. I talked about how silence can accuse and how presence can correct without spectacle. I did not tell a story about a mother or a child. I talked about benches and signs and how a single sentence like "no loitering" becomes a verdict when space runs out. I spoke about risk and how institutions confuse being careful with being distant. I admitted where I had been careful in ways that harmed. The room grew quiet, not because it was impressed, but because it recognized itself. A board member asked whether this approach exposed us to liability. I said, liability grows when people feel unseen and shrinks when processes are humane. Another asked whether consistency could be maintained. I said consistency begins when we stop treating compassion as discretionary. I did not ask for applause. I asked for review cycles and metrics that tracked time weighted and warmth provided. I asked for accountability that lived beyond my tenure. When it ended, I left without taking questions in the hallway. I went to the lobby and sat where anyone could sit. The mother arrived later that afternoon with the girl. They did not know about the meeting. That was intentional. The girl showed me a new exercise she could do without help. The mother watched and nodded. She said she had noticed changes spreading to other entrances and other units. She said people seemed less hurried in small ways. I said small ways mattered. She asked whether I had told their story. I said no. She closed her eyes briefly and then smiled. She said thank you for not borrowing their lives to make a point. I stayed seated and accepted the thanks without storing it. The girl asked if people listened when adults talked about benches. I said they listened when benches talked first. She laughed and said benches were brave. The next week, a reporter called asking about policy changes and rumors of a personal catalyst. I declined comment and referred them to the operations update. Speaking without hiding did not mean speaking everywhere. It meant choosing rooms where truth could land without becoming content. I continued to sit on different days and at different times. Sometimes the bench was empty and sometimes it held strangers who needed a place to be still. I learned names and forgot them and learned again. The mother did not need me as often. That was the point. One evening, she asked if I would attend a school meeting with her because forms made her anxious. I said yes and sat behind her without speaking unless asked. When asked, I answered plainly and then deferred back to her. Afterwards, she said that was how support should feel. The girl handed me a folded note later with a drawing of a mouth closed and eyes open. She said it meant listening while talking. I put it in my pocket and kept it there through meetings that tested me. The hospital invited me again to speak at a staff training. I declined and suggested a rotating panel of volunteers and clinicians instead. I offered to sit in the back. That is where I learned the most. One night, I overheard a resident explain a delay with honesty instead of jargon. The family relaxed. The resident relaxed. Systems improved one conversation at a time. Months turned and seasons shifted. The girl walked without the wheelchair more often. The mother returned to work part-time and asked if I would help her practice a route on the bus. I walked with them and counted stops. When she no longer needed me, I stepped back. Belonging without title meant accepting replacement by competence. The day came when the mother asked if I would stop sitting so often because the girl worried when she saw me there. She said it made her think something was wrong. I laughed and agreed. I would still come sometimes, just not as a fixture. That night, I sat at home and felt the ache of absence and let it pass. Speaking without hiding had changed me in ways I could not undo. It had made me accountable to spaces, not stages. It had taught me to accept correction without defense. When I returned weeks later, it was to bring nothing and to take nothing. The mother greeted me like a neighbor. The girl waved and ran ahead. We sat for a minute and then stood because standing was right that day. As we parted, the mother said something that landed heavier than praise. She said you did not make us feel small when you spoke. You made us feel safe. I nodded and let that be enough. The bench remained where it always had been, and I left it as I found it. Belonging did not arrive all at once, and it did not announce a finish line. It settled the way weather settles when a season turns and you only notice after the air feels different. A year passed and the hospital learned to breathe with itself. Waiting areas were warmer and clearer and less punitive. Signs changed their language and so did people. The girl grew taller and steadier. She learned which days were hard and which were manageable and how to say both without apology. The mother found a rhythm that held. Work returned in pieces and so did sleep. I did not keep count of how often I sat down anymore. I measured staying by whether the system held when I was not there. Most days it did. When it did not, I asked questions and stepped back. The bench became ordinary again, and that was its victory. The girl stopped drawing benches and started drawing paths. She showed me one afternoon a page filled with lines that met in the middle. She said it was a map of where people go when they choose not to leave. I asked where the map started. She said everywhere. The mother watched us with a calm that had replaced vigilance. She said she trusted the process now more than any person. I said that was the goal. We did not celebrate anniversaries. We noticed improvements and named them and then kept going. When setbacks came, we did not dramatize them. We adjusted. One winter night, the lobby filled again and volunteers moved quickly and chairs were enough. No one was sent outside. I sat and watched and felt a quiet pride that did not need to be shared. The girl waved at me from across the room and then went back to her book. The mother spoke with a nurse and laughed. I stood and left early because staying was not required that night. Belonging earned meant knowing when to go. In spring, the hospital invited families to a small gathering to mark a year of changes. I attended without speaking. The mother spoke briefly about time and dignity and thanked people by role, not by name. The girl sang a short song she had learned and forgot a line and laughed. The room laughed with her. I did not sit in the front. I did not sit in the back. I stood near the wall and listened. Later outside, the mother asked if I would walk them to the car. We walked and talked about ordinary things. The girl asked if I would always be around. I said I would be nearby in the way that counted. She thought about that and said, okay. She called me by a name that was not father and not friend and not mine. It was a name she invented that meant the person who does not leave. I accepted it without correcting her. The mother smiled and said names mattered less than patterns. I agreed. Summer came and the girl started school. She did not need the wheelchair anymore. She still needed rest and patience and time. We practiced routes and schedules and then stopped practicing. I did not attend the first day. The mother sent a picture later and I smiled and put the phone down. I learned to receive news without inserting myself into it. The board asked for a report and I gave numbers and left out stories. A reporter asked for an interview and I declined. Speaking without hiding did not mean speaking everywhere. It meant choosing the right silences. On a quiet afternoon, I returned to the bench and found a small note tucked beneath it. It was in the girl's handwriting and said thank you for staying until we could stay ourselves. I folded it and put it in my wallet. I did not reply. Replies were not necessary anymore. Autumn arrived and with it a test that reminded us progress was not permanent. Staffing thinned and the lobby tightened. I sat and asked questions and others answered before I could finish. That was new. I stood and left. The system held. Winter followed and with it another year. The girl brought me a scarf she had knitted unevenly. She said it was for when people waited. I laughed and accepted it. The mother said she had enrolled in a class and felt brave again. I said bravery looked like consistency. She agreed. We did not talk about the beginning often. When we did, it was with distance and gratitude, not nostalgia. The bench remained a bench. The doors opened and closed. People came and went. Some stayed longer than they wanted. Some left sooner than they should have. I learned that belonging earned was not possession. It was permission renewed daily by behavior. On the last day I write this, I sit for a moment and then stand because it is time to go. The girl is older and busy. The mother is capable and supported. The system is kinder than it was and still imperfect. I did not save anyone. I did not rescue a family. I sat down and kept sitting until sitting was no longer needed. That is how belonging is earned. Not by money or power or titles, but by the simple discipline of presence applied over time. I leave the bench where it is and walk away, knowing that walking away now is not leaving. It is trust. Before you leave this story, I want to ask you to stay just a little longer. Not for me, not for the channel, but for yourself. Because if you watched this all the way through, it means something here touched a place in you that does not respond to noise or speed. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you almost walked away, or a moment when someone did. Maybe you recognized the quiet weight of waiting, the kind that does not make headlines and does not ask for pity, the kind that simply asks to be seen. Stories like this are not about CEOs or hospitals or benches. They are about the small choices we make when no one is clapping and no one is watching, choices that feel inconvenient and risky and unnecessary in the moment, but somehow shape the rest of our lives. Many of us grew up believing that help always looks like action, like fixing, like solving, like money or authority stepping in at the right time. But life teaches us otherwise. Life teaches us that what heals most deeply is not rescue, but presence. Sitting instead of leaving. Listening instead of explaining. Staying long enough for trust to form. If this story stirred something in you, it may be because you remember a time when you needed someone to stay, or a time when you wished you had stayed for someone else. And maybe you have carried that memory quietly, without judgment, without language, letting it live somewhere behind your ribs. This channel exists for those quiet memories, for the moments that did not look heroic but mattered anyway, for the people who know that dignity is not loud and love does not always announce itself. If you are still here, I invite you to reflect on one simple question. Where in your life could staying change something even slightly? It does not have to be dramatic. It could be a conversation you keep avoiding, a person you have learned to rush past, a place where you once felt unwelcome and never returned. Staying does not mean fixing everything. It means showing up honestly, without armor, without needing control. And that is not easy. It takes courage to sit in discomfort without reaching for an exit. If you found value in this story, then subscribing is not about supporting a channel. It is about choosing more moments like this in your life. Stories that slow you down instead of winding you up. Stories that respect your intelligence, your experience, your lived years. Stories that do not rush to tell you what to feel, but trust you to feel it on your own time. When you subscribe, you are not signing up for content. You are choosing a space where reflection is welcome and where quiet strength is honored. And if you feel moved to comment, you do not need to say anything clever or polished. A simple sentence is enough. You might write about a moment you stayed when it would have been easier to leave, or a moment you wish you had. You might write nothing at all and simply sit with the story a bit longer. That is allowed too. This is not a place for shouting. It is a place for recognition. We post stories like this because many people are tired of being told that only big gestures matter, because many people know that the world does not change only through power, but through presence repeated over time. If you are one of those people, then you belong here. And if today was heavy, if this story stirred something you were not expecting, take a breath before you go. Let the feeling settle instead of pushing it away. Remember that staying is not a single act. It is a practice. And sometimes simply choosing to stay with a story until the end is already a beginning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And when the moment comes in your own life when you stand at the edge deciding whether to walk away or sit down, I hope you remember this feeling and trust it.